Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest from the heart of the continent, sports reporter and investigative reporter from the Winnipeg Free Press, Jeff Hamilton. Jeff, I'm excited to talk with you today. Being a Winnipeg boy, just like myself, you've covered a lot of different events and things in the duration of your career that's still continuing to roll. Happy to have you here, man.
Honestly, man, it's a pleasure to be on. I know we've been trying to get together for a little bit here, but I've heard great things about the pod and about you yourself. So looking forward to taking in whatever questions you have and making a good podcast with you.
So the first thing we need to get out of the way right now is, do Bomber fans need to breathe, or is there some genuine concern with how they finished going into their bye week? Because the sky isn't falling, but maybe not the right way that you want to head into the bye, and against a team like Montreal, who is not always the most consistent or disciplined.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, on that line right there, I mean, obviously the Montreal Alouettes are not quite the BC Lions or the Calgary Stampeders. So it might be, had the Bombers lost to, say, one of those two teams who they're, battling for top spot in the West, it might be a little bit easier to digest the loss. But, as you mentioned, it's not a great way to go into the bye, but you also have to realize it's the Winnipeg's first bye of the regular season. So they played 10 straight weeks in a row. Nobody else had done that. Regina, or Saskatchewan rather, they had their first bye week in week 10. So they were kind of close to the Bombers. They played 9 straight weeks. And I think by the end of the 10 weeks, we did ask the Bombers, obviously, including head coach Mike O'Shea, if they were tired or if they were running on fumes. And of course, they weren't going to use it as an excuse. So they said no, but you could tell. I mean, you could tell in that game against Montreal right from the opening kickoff, there just wasn't that energy, there wasn't that gusto. And so if you're a Bomber fan, I mean, certainly it's hard to suggest a loss as a positive. I think you can make an argument in that the whole narrative of a perfect season, as we were already starting to talk about, as the Bombers went 9-0, that's no longer going to be something in the background. But I think more importantly, it came at a time where, although the Montreal Alouettes aren't juggernauts, the Bombers are not, invincible. And so, when you consider all their first 9 games or their first 10 games, 6 of those being on the road in different time zones and having no break. And the fact that they could have easily won that game with Mark Leggio, missing a 32-yard field goal with no time left. It was that close to being 10-0. Again, I'm not going to tell Bomber fans they shouldn't be disappointed, but I think there is a little bit of perspective in play here that, if you were to ask the Bombers if they'd be 9-1 heading into their week 11 bye, I think they would take it. So, this is certainly not ideal for them. I think they would have wanted to, especially damning considering it didn't tie that franchise mark set in 1960 for 10 straight victories. I know there's a little bit of pride there that, again, they'll never admit it because they always talk about going week to week. But, all things considered, certainly disappointing for fans. But, I'm willing to let them off the hook, given the fact they're 9-1 and atop a pretty competitive West Division.
And you have to think about the importance of adversity coming through a season, because if you look back to that 1960 team, they didn't even make the Grey Cup. And I think sometimes getting lost in the records and the undefeated, and we have to play all our starters and all this stuff, I think is kind of nonsense, because at the end of the day, I remember sitting there like a lot of Winnipeg fans probably when Chris Trevler was the starter and we didn't know what was going to happen with Collaros in 2019, thinking, when's this team going to get a break? And are they even going to make the playoffs? They clinched it almost what seemed like haphazardly. And when Collaros came in to start, the rest is history. So I think that you do make a lot of good points in mentioning that it's not really quintessential for them to get hung up over one loss heading into a bye after playing 10 straight weeks.
Well, I don't think the Bombers are. I think they're disappointed. I think they're disappointed in the fashion in which they lost. But I don't think that they're. I think a lot of the noise is coming from outside the locker room. I mean, this is people say, even as you mentioned, I mean, it's not great to go into a bye week with a loss, but these guys were certainly looking forward to getting the week off. I think this is going to bode well for their injuries. Get some guys healed up, get away from the game, because as a reporter covering this team every single day, it can get pretty old hearing the same sound bites, right? The 1-0s, the focus on this week. I mean, we pepper them with questions every week about their opponent, about their records, about, what's working, what's not, what It's not working. And that can be exhausting from a reporter. I can only imagine what it's like as a player fielding those questions week in and week out without a break. And then obviously the real hard work, the practicing, then leading up to games. I mean, that's a physical toll on them. So, as you mentioned, I don't see this as, I don't see this as an awesome thing per se. And that, I think there are some advantages maybe to getting that loss out. Again, one being that we're not asking them about the perfect season. Mike O'Shea, a guy who goes week to week, seemingly minute by minute, just hates thinking about this idea of thinking, through an 18-game season midway through. So I think that takes a little bit of focus off that kind of stuff. It's certainly, I think you can make the argument too that you want to suffer a loss earlier than later, and I don't think that the Bombers were going to go 18-0 anyways. I think they're still in pretty good position to, obviously in good position at 9-1. Of course, the BC Lions are not far behind at 7-1 and they're rolling. But I just think this is, I don't even want to classify it as a wake-up call, but I do think it's a reminder that, when you look at that game, and I'm not, you can put it on Mark Leggio for missing, the field goal at the end of the fourth quarter, and then again in overtime to cement the loss. But the O-line looked tired, right? They had been battling injuries and going week to week with a new group. You look at, Zach Collaros could use the break. He was running for his life for a lot of that game against the Alouettes. So I just think it comes obviously at a good time in the sense that they played for so many weeks, but this team is so dialed in, so prepared, so ready. It's not going to affect them coming out of their vacation. And, I'm expecting things to get back to normal. And again, I think an ejection or a step away from the game comeback is going to eject a lot of positive and good feelings for what will be a pretty interesting second half of the season, because the Bombers have this week off, and then they have 2 more bye weeks in the last eight games of the season, and a majority of those games, I believe, if you do the math, I think 6 or 5 of them are at home and 3 are on the road. So it's a pretty good schedule for the Bombers coming back to, and you know that they wanted to get that break out of the way, and they'll get back to work when next week.
I do want to ask for your perspective on the situation with kicking, because I know that for someone like myself as a former kicker, it's something I think about all the time, and something that fans will very easily chirp without thinking about the realistic logistics around the situation. Now, last year, obviously, Leggio they put a lot of trust in him last year, to be honest. And then I think once they realized how far they were pushing him, and then they brought in Mortada, and then that didn't work out for a while, and they were scrambling. They finally got Castillo, and things became stable. But now Castillo is on the Elks, so there's not really a chance that he's going to be magically able to be traded during the season. So with Mark Leggio, with that being the last, or those being the last 2 kicks that he's experienced going into the bye, do you think that the leash has shortened to a few inches for Mark Leggio the rest of the way? Because clearly, if the Bombers can't make some magical Grey Cup winning trade in the second half, he's probably the best option they have to rely on.
You're right. And I mean, you have Ali Murtada on the practice roster too. He was obviously with the Bombers last season, and he lost his job to Sergio Castillo as well. It's fascinating that you bring up, I mean, you'd have a great perspective as a guy who's kicked in this game. So, I mean, you bring up Sergio Castillo and the likelihood of not being a trade. I don't know about that. The Edmonton Elks are not doing well. They're still technically in the West race, but they just lost their, I think, 13th or 12th straight home game. They're not looking good. They don't look like they're going to be in the top 4 of the West and get the crossover. So who knows if Chris Jones will be willing to help out the Winnipeg Blue Bombers get the three-peat. It's certainly going to take something. They're not going to give away for nothing, but maybe that's getting a little too ahead of ourselves suggesting a Castillo trade. But you're right, and I think the whole kicking situation is fascinating with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, because when you rewind before 2019, where they gave Mark, or sorry, 2021, where they gave Mark Leggio the reins. Here you go, you're going to be the guy. They committed to Justin Medlock for massive money. This team knew exactly what the importance is in having a for sure as you can get kicker, and how important that was to finishing off drives. And if you look at Mark Leggio's work, I mean, he wasn't bad coming into the game. He was 18 for 20. which is obviously a decent mark through 9 games. But the thing was, he's a protected kicker. They don't bring him out for the 55 yarder. They don't bring him out for the, they don't bring him out on, like, his range is not at all even close to Justin Medlock. It'd be a no-brainer. Every time they got within 56, 55 yards, they bring out Justin Medlock and he'd nail most of them. So, there's already that loss. And I think, it's an interesting thing with Mike O'Shea is he's a big guy on trust. Now, I'm not going to liken it, exactly to like a Andrew Harris, but Andrew Harris was one of the most beloved players in Winnipeg until he was, and was a big part of this team until he lost the trust of the head coach. And that was not working out in the offseason. So that's not Mark Leggio's problem with trust. Mark Leggio's problem with trust is kicking the kick when it matters the most. And it'd be one thing, I think, if it was one opportunity, like if he had just missed, the 32-yarder that led to the loss. But the fact that he missed a 37-yarder after that in overtime to cement the loss for the Bombers, I think that damages his trust big time. So you asked the question about is his leash shorter? Absolutely, it's shorter. I think he's going to get the benefit of the doubt. Look, I don't think the Bombers are looking for a kicker necessarily throughout this week. I mean, Mike O'Shea's in North Bay having his vacation and bye too. Kyle Walters maybe making calls. I don't know. I think Mark Leggio comes back and he's the kicker, but I don't think he's the kicker come playoffs. And I don't know if there's enough that he can do this season that's going to convince Mike O'Shea that push comes to shove in the biggest game of the season, which will be the West Final, or wherever the Bombers finish, West Semi, if they somehow fall out of the top spot in the West, is going to have to be it's going to be tough to convince him. I think he's going to have a tough time convincing himself, that being Mike O'Shea, that Mark Leggio can make that kick, that he can be that guy in the final thing. I mean, if he goes perfect the rest of the season and starts nailing things, that he, shows a level of consistency that we haven't seen him, in his career, then maybe. But I think at this point, you need to know for sure in your kicker. And if you're able to swing a deal for whether that be a trade late, whether that be a Sergio Castillo or somebody else, or bring somebody in and give them an opportunity, I think that's going to be it. Because look, Mark Leggio is a nice guy. He's a good dude and he's a decent kicker, and his punting has improved vastly. I think he's done very well in the punt game. So I don't think he loses his spot on the team. But I do think that it would be almost derelict of duty for the Bombers if things continue the way they have been, where he's missing, reachable or hittable kicks, to not bring in reinforcements. So if you're asking me what I think the Bombers do, I think they bring back Mark Leggio. I'm sure he's kicking field goals, when they return and play Calgary in the first game back. But I feel fairly confident in suggesting that Mark Leggio will probably not be the kicker for the Bombers in the playoffs because of that game.
There's one thing that I noticed that I think maybe not a lot of people pay attention to, which was a sign of questionability. The rotation on the ball when he kicks it always has kind of made me feel uneasy when watching it. If you go back and watch the film of the Calgary game, when you see the slow end over end rotation, if you watch someone like Rene Paredes or Lewis Ward, you watch the way the ball comes out, or Sean White, sometimes it's a bit, it's not perfect, but he's extremely consistent. You watch those three guys, Sean White, Paredes, or Lewis Ward, and then you watch sometimes the way that Leggio's ball is really good, and other times it's not so good, or it turns, but it still goes through. And guys will always tell you on the team, oh, well, it goes through, so 3 points is 3 points, man. Don't worry about it. But at the end of the day, if that's a consistent habit, like we saw in the Montreal game, people were saying, how is that possible? That was the worst kick attempt I've ever seen, and all those sorts of things. But when your technique is not there to get that consistent rotation, one of those will happen once in a very rare while. And if it happens at the wrong time, it could really cause collateral damage to your psychology, is all I'll say.
Let me flip something to you then, because you're the kicker guy. So I feel like, so a lot of people, after that kick, I mean, let's not, like, I don't want to say don't get me started on the whole punting option. I think it's quite embarrassing to, not go to a kicker for a 32-yard field goal and just, punt it out there through the end zone, which I think would have been more difficult than people let on. You get the ball further back. You got to add the 20 yards through the end zone. And then you got to add the fact that there's a guy waiting on the back line to get
Or
it.
multiple.
So it's not like or multiple. Exactly. So you don't have, it's not just a 55 yarder. It's probably more like a 65 yard punt. I know, anyways, we don't have to get into that per se, but I'm wondering to you, like, I thought, because the idea of just blasting a field goal as hard as you possibly could, so that if you don't get it, you at least clear it for a single. I believe, we don't know because I haven't had a chance to talk to Mark, but I think he tried to do that. I think he tried to step into it as hard as he possibly could. And I don't know if he slipped or tripped or whatever the mechanics go into kicking, but I think what you saw, which was, as you alluded to, was the worst possible outcome for a kick, right? Because it was an absolute shank. I don't know if my belief is he was trying to go as hard as he possibly could and led to that. Other people have suggested to me that they thought he was trying to do almost a chip shot, and that's what led to it. So I don't know if you recall exactly how the ball went, but what do you think is more likely? Him trying to hammer it as hard as he can, or him chip shotting to get the result that we saw that was just so wacky to the left?
Jeff, I believe that you are correct, and that is exactly why the ball went like that. And you know why?
I knew I liked you. Yeah.
Because, well, first thing, when I played on the Winnipeg Rifles, we had some interesting coaching decisions on special teams. That's just what I'll say. When we played against Calgary, they opted to allow, we were on the 28-yard line or 25-yard line. They said, let's punt to guarantee that it's a 2-possession game instead of kick a field goal. And if I sit here and told you that that's not the biggest insult I've ever received in my career, then I'd be lying to you. And the second thing is, having worked with one of the best kicking, or the best kicking coach for any player that's played in the CFL, and even in my opinion, for anyone who's played south of the border for that matter, Don Sweet, you learn a lot from someone like him who is so detailed, but yet so simple in his teaching mechanics. And if you look at the guys that he's worked with and coached, you notice that there's kind of a trend. He had the chance to work with someone like Richie Leone, Paul McCallum, Sean White, Rob Maver, Rene Paredes, Chris Milo, all guys who were all-stars at least once in their career in the CFL.
Totally.
When you try to approach the ball, and this was what I was explaining to people in the newsroom, they were asking, like, how did he miss that? When you try to punch it as hard as you can and you go with just unadulterated violence at the ball with your foot, your technique goes out the window. So when you watch the clip back in the slow motion, that second replay on TSN, he tried to punch the ball, not like a straight from behind toe kicker, but tried to swing at it with all his might. And you could see that he lost his technique, causing the ball to look like someone had thrown it poorly rather than having that end over end rotation. And when I played on the Rifles in a game against the Hilltops, I had missed a field goal from 42 yards or 45 yards, just wide left. So I was like, oh my goodness, like I was in my head and I was so worried. And so I said, next time out there, I'm just not even going to think about it. Just hammer it, whatever, it'll go through. And guess what happened? The ball had the exact same flight as Mark Leggio's. So when I watched it, it was reminiscent of a time that I was in his exact same position. So I knew what was going through his mind. He tried to punch as hard as he could. And you get in your head, whether it be because they went out there and he's sitting and the time's winding down, or you have to make it. The second those things jump into your mind and you're not just like, oh, it's another ordinary kick, that's when you've lost. So if you talk to someone like a Sean White, he told me a story one time when I was at Vancouver on Raiders spring training camp, when he was back on the Alouettes. And he told me a story when he was in practice. He's like, I hit like 20 field goals in a row and I missed the last one. And the reporter asked me, how come you missed it? What went wrong? He's like, no, that's just the way she goes. Sometimes you hit it well and goes left or right. There's not really too much behind it. Don't think about it and just move on. If you would have talked to Justin Medlock, which I'm sure you would have, and you had the chance to ask him, well, what do you do when you miss? Or in the one game against Edmonton, I think in 2018, he missed twice. And he's like, you just take a sip of Gatorade, think about it. What did I do wrong? Okay. And you flush it. The second you go out there and you knew when the Bombers had to kick another field goal, everyone's holding their breath because they know, well, he just screwed up big time. Now he's trying to redeem himself. And then he babied the ball by trying to not hit it too hard. And that's the opposite end of the spectrum, because the ball is going to sail to the direction that your foot swings, which for him is right. So you could see that there was fast rotation, drifted to the right, kisses off the upright. and Bomber fans pull out the pitchforks. So I know that that's a long-winded answer to what
No,
seems
it's
like
great.
something that's so simple, but at the end of the day, if it was so simple, anyone would be able to do it.
Well, and the other thing too, and I'll just finish off on like my point of that is like the idea of like, this, people saying just boom the ball, just hammer it, right? It was about a 55-yard field goal to get it through, so it would have been an extra 20 yards. So it would have been a 57-yard field goal. That's not Mark Leggio. That's not in Mark Leggio's range. He can't do 57-yard field goals. He can't, he's pulled up on shorter than that. So the idea that he'd have to come out of his shoes, he'd almost have to hit it harder than he's ever hit it for it to go that way. And I know there's some videos in college of his hitting like a 60 something yarder or whatever, but
that's in the field with nobody and just,
well, and that's what I mean.
Exactly.
And in the pro game, it's not that easy. So we can, you can debate on whether they should have punted or field goal. I just, to my original point, and you confirmed, it's embarrassing to go to your kicker and go, we don't trust you on a 32-yard field goal.
It's an extra point.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't understand people, like, again, sometimes it's being an armchair kicker. People think that it's so easy, my grandma could do it. But yet when you go out there at halftime and you see them trying to kick a 15-yard field goal, basically an old extra point for $1,000, they can't even get it above the uprights. So
yeah, exactly.
People should be able to, put the ball through the uprights before they put their money where their mouth is when it comes to kicking in professional football.
Sure, absolutely. So Mark Leggio, I think, lives to kick another day. We'll just see. I don't want to say his days are numbered, because I hope he does turn things around, because he is a really good guy and he's done some good things. It's just one of those things that when push comes to shove, like, to think that you could get it done in the playoffs when you couldn't in this situation, I think it's a tough sell that will need a lot for him to do over this last 8 games to prove that he's capable of it.
So changing gears here a bit, I know that you have done stuff in sports that's not always focused on being a beat reporter and covering the game, and especially being from Winnipeg. People know in the Canadian sports media scene that there's not a whole whack or abundance of jobs. Not that there's necessarily none, and definitely more than a lot more cities people would give Winnipeg credit for. But like you were mentioning before we started recording, you kind of had to have that edge. And so you've done investigative reporting similar to the subject matter from that of Rick Westhead and other investigative reporters who work across the country. What made you decide that you wanted to have that as your edge in your job?
Yeah, you know what? It's interesting. Because when I went to school, I wanted to be, I don't even think I knew what journalism was, which is kind of funny. I think I needed to Google, like, what does a TSN reporter do? And then I think I realized it was journalism. And that was the degree I had to go after. And so, my goal throughout, like, early in my career was sports. I wanted to be a beat reporter, like most journalists. I wanted to travel. I wanted to cover the games. I wanted to interview the athletes, just all those things. Right. And so I was fortunate, and I say fortunate, lucky, all those things. I mean, it's a very interesting profession. It's an incredibly tough industry to crack, to stay, to get opportunity and all that stuff. And I was, in a lot of ways, it certainly takes talent, and I felt like I had some of that, but it often takes being in the right place at the right time. And so, I got my opportunity to go to the Free Press after spending years at CBC doing a little bit of sports, particularly the Jets. And then got my opportunity to join the Winnipeg Free Press in 2015. And it wasn't long after that, by 2016, I was the beat reporter for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers after Hall of Fame writer Ed Tate took a job with the team. And we had a couple other exits. Gary Lawless, who was our sports columnist, he left to the Vegas Golden Knights. Tim Campbell, who was our Jets beat reporter, he left to get a job at NHL.com. So I kind of went from being kind of at the bottom of the barrel to rising to the top. And so, I got an opportunity to do exactly what I wanted to relatively early into my career at the Winnipeg Free Press. And I loved covering the CFL. I enjoyed covering the NHL, but, I'll be honest with you, it kind of I don't want to say got old to me, but I think it maybe got a little bit stale. And I think, I'm an avid reader of journalism. So I read an absolute ton. I don't just read the gamers. I read a lot of work that, and over the years, as I've matured in my career with my craft, I started to see things that I wanted to do. I started to read things that I felt I was capable of doing or wanted to try. I think a lot of people want to do investigative work. It's a bit of I don't want to say high profile, but it's a bit, it's certainly, a lot more, how would I say this? It's a lot more, you get a lot more out of it. You know what I mean? You do investigative work, you can change the world. You can change the way people do policy. You can hold people accountable. You can hold companies accountable, in cases you can hold teams accountable. Whereas, that kind of feeling you get doing those things is different than writing a gamer or writing, a profile on players, which I love doing as well. I love writing and telling, great stories. But I guess that what got me into the investigative side was just an appetite for more, an appetite for something different, an appetite for something more challenging, something that I knew wasn't going to be easy. And again, some of my favorite journalists, like a Rick Westhead, a Katie Strang, the people who are doing incredible, investigative work in journalism, and not just in sports, you know what I mean? Outside of sports, I read, you read a ton of people who, just things that leave you with this feeling of, wow, that's incredible journalism, or wow, I'm in an industry, that allows me to do this, and more specifically at a company, at a paper like the Winnipeg Free Press, that actually dedicates resources to doing it. So I'd been doing a little bit what I would call outside the game stories work for a while. I wouldn't necessarily say a ton of investigative work, but some there for sure. Breaking stories, whether that be on the Jets beat or on the Bombers beat, which entailed a lot of investigative work, which gives you that adrenaline as you're trying to create relationships and get information before people and all that stuff. And then I got the real opportunity to do investigative work when the Free Press came to me and asked me to look into the Graham James scandal. So anyone from Winnipeg or hockey, and it's interesting how few people know who Graham James is now, like the new generation, and I probably a good thing to a certain degree, but the work came to me and said, look, this is something that, yes, it's in some ways well documented with what Graham James did. And anyone who doesn't know Graham James, obviously that infamous former Western Hockey League coach who sexually abused on record or in charges 7 different players, with police estimating dozens more, if not potentially triple digits, is what some cops estimate. And so a lot of ways it was a Winnipeg thing, even though he spent a lot of time in Swift Current, then went to Calgary before he was ultimately busted, when Sheldon Kennedy came forward in 1996. So for me, it was, well, what are questions that weren't answered? And that was really, we had some answers, right? We had, he admitted to doing some things, but we never really understood how he got away with it, or who knew what and when. And I set out in 2017, early 2017, to figure that out. And so, it took me 3 years. It took, and I wasn't doing, nonstop investigative work, but I can tell you this, from the moment I had that put on my desk to the moment it was published in December of 2020, I thought about it every single day. Whether I worked on it every single day, I thought about it every single day. And that was really my introduction into, if for lack of a better term, hardcore investigative, extensive investigative journalism. And I got hooked. I was all hours. It was everything I enjoyed about journalism. It was fostering trust and relationships with sources. It was holding people to account. It was using my interviewing skills. It was writing for 9 straight months to do a 6-part series that was about more than 30,000 words. And so it was everything I wanted to achieve. And I don't want to say everything I wanted to achieve in my career, but everything that I loved about my profession that I was able to do on a somewhat regular basis. And then once you start doing that, and you realize whether you can handle it. And so, I'll just, I'll give you a heads up, and I've been open about this before. I had therapy for 6 months afterwards, just to unlock some of the stuff that I'd maybe, dug deep and left there or whatever, any kind of, and a lot of this, and to be fair, like, it wasn't, I had people, medical professionals from around the country reach out to me, and I end up taking the advice of a guy in Winnipeg who was kind of helping me with the story anyways, and so that worked out. But anyways, my point in that is saying you realize that you can handle this, and that all of a sudden, kind of in my case, I felt like I was good at it. I was good at all those things I had mentioned, from fostering relationships to interviewing to writing these kind of stories, because I'll be honest with you, I read a ton. And so after that, you kind of get you get bitten by it, and it's not just this, like, oh, I can do these like grandiose stories, I can get nominated for national awards for them, which I did for the Stain on Our Game series. It's about helping people, and that is addicting. Helping people who are in tough situations with your skill set. I don't know if there's a greater feeling for me, to be honest with you. Now, I don't have kids, so I'm sure that would be up there if I had children, but it really became a passion, a love for doing this. And so, and you also get a realization from doing it that there's so many other things out there that need to be held accountable. I mean, you can do, if you look at Rick Westhead and Katie Strang, two people I mentioned, and there's others out there, you could, like, abuse in sport could be a full-time beat. And it could be an everyday job. I mean, as sad as that sounds, that's the reality. And so after I finished up that series, it was just like, what's next? What can we do? What can we do now? What can I do with the sources I've gained? What can I do with sources I've gained after the series went? Because you get into a certain situation with investigative journalism, and you start off because no one knows who you are. I mean, or they know you as a sports reporter or a political reporter, whatever beat you might cover. Well, once you start doing some pretty extensive investigative work, people start realizing who you are and what you do on it, and then people come to you. And so you get, you might start with the story ideas, but then the story ideas come to you. And so all those things, this is a long roundabout way of saying all those things have kind of put me in a position to continue to do it. And I want to do it. I mean, I love covering the CFL. I love covering, the NHL, obviously the teams here. I mean, I enjoy it. I enjoy, the approach I take. Some people don't love it. I'm a little harder on the athletes than the average person. Maybe that's part of it because of my investigative journalism. I really don't, have a lot of time for, people who whine about certain things like a bad power play or a tough question. But it really does come down to a passion. And so once I finished the Stain on Our Game series, it really just turned into okay, so what else can I do to help? What else can I do to help other people? What else can I do to help a sport like hockey that I grew up loving, get back on its right track? How do I hold people like Hockey Canada members accountable, and everything we're seeing now? I mean, it's just, I mean, these are things that a lot of us before for years we're banging on the doors saying Hockey Canada won't talk to anybody. Hockey Canada won't, they don't have time for anyone. They feel like they play by their own rules. So, I look at what's happening now, and of course I wouldn't wish any of that stuff on some of the young women who have gone through just heinous experiences of rape and abuse from hockey players. But at the same time, I mean, I'm glad that these people are being held accountable. I'm glad that Hockey Canada is being held accountable, that it's no longer get into a room, or hopefully will no longer be bring a victim or a person who's made allegations against somebody within the game, bring them into a room, hear their story out, and figure out what their payout's going to be. It's actually taking care of it and preventing it from happening again. So it's kind of a little bit off topic as far as my interest in investigative journalism, but at the same time, I mean, there aren't a ton of people that do it, and particularly in sports. There's lots of investigative reporters out there, lots of talented, investigative reporters, but there's not a ton in sports. And so I feel like, whether I consider it my duty or whether it's my passion or whatever, I feel like, I feel like it's important to, while, sports should be an avenue for people to have entertainment, to have fun. I like providing that, and whether it be game stories or profiles of players, I find it equally, if not more important, to ensure that the game is safe for people. And it's that investigative work that you put your soul into to help, that really does have a lasting effect way beyond the number of years you cover a certain team or league.
And especially when you think about the number of people that play professional sports compared to the people that play amateur, like LeBron eating a taco can get more attention than anything in the world because he's so famous. But how many people have experienced just basic hazing, like nothing crazy and like not that, not to diminish any experiences of anybody, but like what people would say, oh, that's not that bad, right? How do you
Totally.
know? How do you know what a person is going through? And the number of times I remember I used to listen to TSN 1290 or the news, going to school in the morning with my dad and hearing, oh, well, this person was hazed or bullied in hockey. And I was like, why does it sound like the same stories repeating itself? And then you see these stories come out with Hockey Canada, or like you said, like Graham James, obviously famous and many years before I was like playing sports.
Mhm.
But it's like you said, it's a very sad reality that there could probably be a beat reporter or someone that would cover it all year round. And it is emotionally taxing. So that's why I could see that there's maybe a justifiable reason psychologically why people wouldn't want to dive into it and why there are so few people who do it in sports. But even like you just mentioned, and I did want to expand on this a little bit,
Mhm.
what did you learn from going to therapy that on a broad level, because obviously it's really deep, but on a broad level, what did you learn about it that you would want to share with people who have maybe a stigma against it or who are considering it but are scared because of the fact that they may be labeled as crazy or some lunatic or there's something wrong with them?
Yeah, for me, like, so I've been fortunate enough to be on a couple different panels talking about investigative journalism. So one of the things I often say or talk about is, look, you'll never be able to feel the full pain that someone goes through, whether they were abused, whether, sexually, physically, verbally, emotionally, whatever it may be. You'll never be able to feel that fully. But if you're going to tell their story, you have to feel it partially. So you take in some of that. You take in some of that. And I think as reporters, it's pretty easy to, say you have thick skin, say that, things don't bother you and whatever. And that might be true. Because for me, for instance, like I wasn't after the Graham James series, was published, I wasn't looking for help. I wasn't looking for therapy. I didn't think I needed it. But like, as I mentioned, I got so many different, messages from people, because one of the big things about the investigation was that my sole goal was, yes, to find out who, who knew what and when, if there were any additional victims, like, and we uncovered more names. But also to get into the grooming process. And the grooming process is the intense part, right? Because a lot of people go, they'll look at what Graham James did and had sexual relations with 7 of his former players, and people are asking the same questions now with Kelsey McKay in Winnipeg, that, the former coach of Vincent Massey, and before that Churchill High School, who had 8 people come forward against him, for sexual abuse. And a lot of these young men, I call them kids because they're teenagers, but they look like men, right? They're built football players, 16 to 19, in both cases for the most part. People go, well, how does a grown man, or an old guy like that, how does he manipulate a player? Or how does a player just not, quote unquote, beat the shit out of him, or that? I get these questions all the time. I got them throughout the years. I still get them. And that was the importance of the grooming, of educating people about the grooming process. Because, and I'm not trying to make light of it with this statement, it is often, explained to me from victims, is almost like a psycho thriller. Like, it's hard to understand. You shouldn't understand how somebody can mentally manipulate somebody to do things that, that they've done, that, to be in those, and I use relationship lightly, but to be in those situations where all of a sudden you don't know you're in it until it's far too late. And so getting into the grooming process and trying to discuss the grooming process and get into those intricacies of that kind of predatory behavior, is a bit of a mind f, and it can certainly, take you to places, some dark places that, again, that you could just brush off, right? Because it's pretty easy to separate yourself from it when it's not you. But as I mentioned, you need to feel some of that, so you have to let some of that in. So to me, after getting those opportunities, and somebody who had therapy earlier in his life as a kid, I knew the importance of it. I knew the importance of talking. I knew the importance of just, airing it out, and to not take up an offer from people. The several offers that I got sounded ridiculous, and when I did accept it, I realized that it did last quite a long time, because I thought it was important. I thought it was, doing a lot for me. I thought it was unpacking a significant amount. And I mean, you can go into the cliches of, sick, not weak, and all those things, and all of them are very much true. But a lot of the times, it's just unpacking a lot of the stuff. It's just talking about some of the things you went over, because at the end of the day, as much as you feel it, you have to, you have to draw a line in the fact that you're a journalist, that you're a writer, but you're also a human. And so I think a lot of people go, well, journalists, they often separate the person, like you would in any profession, from the job. And so that's not the case. And so we're all human beings. We all go through our own stuff. And when you're tackling issues like this, and you're seeing the pain firsthand, it's going to have an effect on you. I think it'd be weird if it didn't have an effect on you, or it'd be, whatever. I think, maybe weird's the wrong word, but it certainly is normal to have that effect on you. So for me, it was more so an opportunity to just unpack some of the stuff I had, and some of the stuff I didn't realize I still had inside, that allows you to kind of move on and do more work. Because I think if I would have not had that, and just kind of went to the next thing, continue to dive into this, I think that would have compounded over time. And maybe I would have had that burnout. Maybe I would have had some of the things I think maybe young journalists fear going into this sphere, right? Because it's pretty easy not to do it. And it's not for everybody, and it won't be for everybody. And it's not every journalist's responsibility to be an investigative reporter. Like any profession, you have different goals and different jobs to do. And just because you're not an investigative journalist doesn't mean you're not a good journalist. But if you do go into investigative work, it is important to talk to people. It's important to have a good structure at work. It's important to have a good editor. I have an incredibly, I would put up there as the best editor in the country, in Scott Gibbons at the Winnipeg Free Press, who helped me throughout that process, help do his job to reel me in when maybe I was going down too many rabbit holes and whatever. And his support, I can't say enough about it. So as much as it's my byline on the investigative work, and it's usually one, or a couple bylines on investigative stories, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and there's a lot of support that needs to happen for that stuff to hit the paper.
The weight that is carried with the stories of the victims and with unpacking it is just, there's so much more to it. Like, even just this conversation is barely touching the tip of the iceberg. But for the listener out there, understanding the importance of therapy, I think, is something that I appreciate bringing light to, because oftentimes when stories like this come out, that's when people say, oh, well, it's okay to go to therapy. Once something crazy, horrible has happened to you, that's when you should go to therapy. But normalizing going, even when you don't feel like something is crazy wrong, or there hasn't been some catastrophic disaster in your life, because by the time those events come around, then there's a lot more to unpack. And not to say it's ever too late, but it makes things maybe a lot more difficult going forward than if you're regularly checking in with yourself. And I know people harp on mental health, and that's a whole other big discussion in and of itself, but just knowing the work you've done and then talking about being open with going to therapy, I think, is an important thing for people to hear real stories from.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would give anybody who would listen, I would say, of course. I mean, it doesn't, whether it's preventative stuff, whether you do have trauma in your life, maybe you have unpacked trauma from childhood, whatever it may be, because, I think one of the effects on me for sure, And I felt like I had a healthy dose of empathy beforehand, but after, doing some of this work, I have a ton of empathy for a lot of people. I have a whole new perspective when it comes to addictions. I have a whole new perspective when it comes to a lot of life's problems. You see homeless people and stuff like, and just, all across the country. And, I think a lot of people, might look away, or turn, might make a stupid comment to their friends, and whatever, but that's a real human being, and you don't know the story behind, him or her. You don't know what those people have been through. And I guess I would leave that on, a little bit of empathy could go a long ways, into supporting one another, and not looking down on each other, not looking at somebody and judging them by, their addiction, or blaming them. You know what I mean? Because an addiction is a very serious thing. It affects the person, but it affects their circle, their family, and it's a wide ranging thing. So the more empathy we can have for people, I think the better, for sure.
A lot of powerful words said. And Jeff, with that, I want to thank you for having been on today's episode. It was a great pleasure to finally get to chat with you and to uncover more about what makes you tick in your career. And also, of course, to talk a little bit of Winnipeg Blue Bomber football.
Hey man, anytime. I really appreciate it. Had a great time, and look forward to more work from you down the road.
And thank you to the listener for enjoying today's episode with Winnipeg Free Press sports and investigative reporter Jeff Hamilton.